We're going to start tonight with John chapter 11 and verse 17. And just a little recap of last week. Last week, Mary and her sister Martha sent a message to Jesus because their brother Lazarus was sick unto death. And Jesus got the message, but he chose to wait until Lazarus was dead because he was going to do a miracle there to reveal the glory of God and reveal that he was God's son. So I'm going to start reading with verse 17. And it says, then when Jesus came, he found that he had, meaning Lazarus, had lain in the grave 4 days already. Now Bethany was close to Jerusalem, about 15 furlongs. That's about 1.75 miles.
Oh, okay.
So that's how far it is. And many of the Jews came to Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. So the fact that many Jews came, it makes you realize that this was a family that was well liked. Mm-hmm. This is a family that had a lot of friends and was well known and kind of prestigious because so many people came to comfort them. So anyway, these Jews that came, they actually would have another opportunity to respond to Christ, because you got to realize a lot of these Jews that were there were Christ's enemies. So that could be another reason why he didn't come right into the town, and he never came into their house. He stayed right outside the town, and he let it be known to the sisters that he was there. But he didn't go into the town or into their house at that point. Then verse 19. And many of the Jews came to Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. Then Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went out and met him. But Mary sat still in the house. I don't think she knew that he was there. Then Martha said unto Jesus, Lord, if thou had been here, my brother would not have died. Now, in my opinion, that's not the way to greet Jesus. Saying, well, if you'd been here, he wouldn't be dead. That's not the way you greet God. That was an inappropriate thing for Martha to say to him. But we'll find out that Mary and Martha, during these 4 days, had both talked about this, that, gosh, if Jesus would have been here, our brother would still be here. And it sounds good, but at the same time, he wasn't responsible for Lazarus' disease that ended up being deadly. So when he does something, it's a gift. But then Martha said, but I know that even now, whatsoever you will ask of God, he will give it to you. So now she's saying, you could probably raise him from the dead. Mm-hmm. They know that he has raised other people from the dead. Then Christ responds to her in verse 23, and he says, oh, thy brother shall rise again. What he's saying to her is, yes, he's going to raise him from the dead. But, she just doesn't get it. She doesn't understand what Jesus is talking about. And the sad part is most people during that time frame did not understand who he was and what his mission was. And then Martha responded, oh, I know that he's going to rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Okay, that's true. She knew that from studying the Old Testament, that there would be a resurrection at the last day. And Jesus said unto her, I am. That's her answer. She says, oh, it's going to be in the last day. And he's like, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes on me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? And she said unto him, well, yes, Lord, I believe that thou art the Christ, the Son of God, which should come into the world. That's a very true statement, but that is not what he asked her.
Yes or no?
He asked her, do you believe in me, that though he were dead, yet shall he live, and whosoever lives and believes in me shall never die? That's what he was asking her. And she said, "Yes, Lord." And this "I believe" is really in a past tense. It's, I have believed. I've always believed who you are. But she didn't really say she knew all of this stuff. And we're going to find out later that she really doesn't. When Christ refers to death, it can mean the end of life, but it also means a separation. Like, let's say when you die, what happens? Your soul separates from your body. That's death. When they left the garden, they died because they were separated from God. So death has that connotation of separation. But what Jesus was saying is that if you believe in me, you're going to live eternally. Everyone's going to die from the curse from the beginning, from Adam and Eve, that they are going to eventually die because they were kicked out of the garden and isolated from the tree of life. So that meant that they would die. But what Christ is trying to say is that if you believe in me, you can live eternally and not die the second death, which I've told you before. Death is separation. And people who die the second death, they're separated from Christ eternally, besides all that lake of fire and other punishment. Right? Okay, so anyway, the method of this whole thing that Christ was talking about in verses 25 and 26 is faith. Mm-hmm. That's how we appropriate this eternal life. And when she, Martha, had said this, she went her way and called Mary her sister. It says secretly, saying, "The master is come and calls for thee." Now, I believe the reason why she called her secretly or went and whispered in Mary's ear is because of the Jews that were there. You got to remember, a lot of Christ's enemies were there. Christ didn't come into the town. He was just outside the town. So I believe, in my opinion, that's why she whispered this to Mary. And then verse 29. As soon as she heard that, she arose quickly and came unto him. Now Jesus was not yet come into the town, but was in that place where Martha had met him. The Jews then were with Mary in the house and comforted her. When they saw Mary, that she rose up in a hurry and went out, they followed her, saying, "Oh, she's going to the grave to weep there." So then Mary was come where Jesus was, and saw him. She fell down at his feet, saying unto him, "Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died." Wow. That's the exact same thing that Martha said. So you know they've been talking about this, that, oh gosh, if Jesus just could have made it in time, and whatever. That because they're both saying to him the identical words. When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews, see, the Jews had followed her, also weeping, which came with her, he groaned in his spirit and was troubled. And I think that what's going on here is that the man part of Jesus, who sees what this horrible curse of death, he wasn't worried about Lazarus because he knew he was going to raise him from the dead. He saw all the sorrow that came upon the sisters who he loved and the Jews. He saw all of this sorrow. And so that's why he groaned in his spirit. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" Now he's saying, I need to go there. And Jesus wept. Now, Jesus was not weeping for Lazarus. We know that because obviously he knows he's going to bring Lazarus back from the dead. But he was weeping for the agony that the people were going through and the hopelessness that they felt. But I want to read a couple of verses. And this one is very interesting. It's Psalm 116, verse 15. This tells you what Jesus and God think of the death of a saint. It says, "Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints." We don't think that, do we? But the Lord does, because he knows now they're coming home to me. So what death is, from our point of view, death is like kind of a horrible thing, because for us, we're never going to see that person again. We don't have this precious in our sight because we don't see him for the rest of our lives. And I know when my father passed away, I wasn't happy. It took me quite a while to get to the point where I said, well, I can't grieve anymore because he's with the Lord. But at first, I did not feel that way. And when I saw him laying there on the floor and his spirit was gone, it's an empty feeling. Yeah, it's a frightful thing. And that's the ultimate punishment from the original curse. Okay, so Jesus wept in verse 35. Then in verse 36, this is very interesting. Then the Jews said, behold how he loved him. So they think he's crying over Lazarus. They don't have a clue, really, why he's crying. They don't know. And some of them said, could not this man which opened the eyes of the blind have caused even this man Lazarus should not have died? They're saying the same thing. Jesus, therefore, again, groaning in himself, comes to the grave. It was a cave, and a stone lay upon it. Now, this groaning in himself, I want to read what Vernon McGee says about that. The subject of death is skirted by people today. The undertakers try in every way to make death seem like a pleasant episode. But let us face it frankly. We can't cover up death by embalming and painting up the face, dressing up the body in a good suit of clothes, and placing it in a pretty coffin surrounded by flowers. Although this is done to help soften the shock, death is an awful thing. For the living, it is. Jesus said, take away the stone. Sounds like he's going to do something, right? But guess who's ready to tell Jesus what to do and to set him straight? Martha. She says, Martha, the sister of him that was dead, said unto him, oh Lord, by this time he stinks, for he's been dead for 4 days. So she's saying, oh, well, no, we don't need to take that stone away. She has absolutely no faith whatsoever, even though before she said, whatever you ask of God, he's going to do. And now she's saying, oh, don't take away the stone. Because he stinks. Like, she's going to inform Jesus?
Yeah.
No.
I know.
No, there's something wrong there. Mm-hmm. Then Jesus said unto her, didn't I say to you that if you would believe, thou would see the glory of God? He's reminding her of the conversation he had earlier. Then they took away the stone from the place where the dead was laid, and Jesus lifted up his eyes to his Father and said, Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me. This is a prayer of thankfulness from Jesus to his Father. And I know that you always hear me. But because of the people which are standing by, I said it, that they may believe that thou hast sent me. So he's letting the people know that God is involved in what's going to happen right here. Yeah, so he was demonstrating publicly his relationship with his Father. And then verse 43. And when he had thus spoken, he cried with a loud voice, a very loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. He commanded the dead. Every time he raised someone from the dead, he commanded them, and they heard them where they were, and they obeyed. And he that was dead came forth, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was bound with a napkin. Jesus said unto them, loose him and let him go. Now, this whole idea of winding them up like a mummy is a very unusual practice. And it's very possible that they got this practice when they lived in Egypt for 400 years, 420 years, because that's what the Egyptians did. It's very unusual practice. And You got to remember that the disciples were with him, and that's one reason why John is writing this. He was present when this happened, and he's giving a detail like the napkin was still on his face. He can give these details because he was there. But I want to read again something McGee says about these grave clothes. It's very interesting. He says, notice that for Lazarus, life was restored to the old body. He came out still wrapped up in his grave clothes. When our Lord rose from the dead, he left all of his grave clothes in place, just as they had been wrapped around his body, including the napkin, which had been wrapped around his head. He came right out of them. He just, yep. Why? Because he came out in a glorified body. They didn't need to roll away the stone for Jesus to come out. It was rolled away so that the people outside could look in and see that the tomb was empty. He went right through the stone. His glorified body could leave the sealed grave, and it could also enter a room where all the doors were locked. All right, so Jesus commands them in verse 44, loose them, let them go, take off these grave clothes. So I'm sure the standers-by did that, and that would be the Jews. And this actually is the end, total end of Christ's public ministry. He doesn't do anything between this. He's going to leave town again, but he doesn't do anything between this and the next Passover when he's going to be the one who's going to die. Verse 45. Then many of the Jews which came to Mary and had seen the things which Jesus did believed on him. You know, that's amazing. But why didn't they all believe? I mean, you just see some guy come out of 4 days of being dead and come out and be alive. It's amazing that only some of them believed. But some of them went their way to the Pharisees and told them the things that Jesus had done. So what happens is that Christ's miracles produce two things. And his word, his testimony, his life. They produce faith or they produce hostility. And that is what is still happening today. And the greater the miracle, the more the hostility. And that's why some of these Jews went immediately to tell the Pharisees, hey, guess what he's done now? He's raised someone from the dead. Okay, that's going to be the end of our story for tonight.